All right, I think we're recording. Awesome. Cool, so just maybe attach the affirmative case in the Zoom chat.
Okay. I always have trouble uploading to Zoom, so it might take me a sec, but hopefully this works. And it's not letting me upload. Okay, one sec. I think it makes me like X out of it. There we go. All right, let me know when everyone is ready. Am I good to go? Okay. Elon Musk, Stephen Hawking, 4,500 AI researchers, and 26,000 others have signed an open letter regarding lethal autonomous weapons. What did it say? The key question for humanity today is whether to start a global AI arms race or to prevent it from starting. Starting a military AI arms race is a bad idea and should be prevented by a ban on offensive weapons beyond meaningful human control. Because I proudly agree with this statement, I affirm the resolution. Resolved: states ought to ban lethal autonomous weapons. Sorry, there's a typo in the document. First, lethal autonomous weapons are defined as those that lack meaningful human control. Since most of these weapons do not currently exist, the ban that the act defends is preemptive. Second, states are defined as governments that rule over a population or territory. I value morality, defined as ethical goodness or rightness. To define what action is the most moral, I offer a value criterion of maximizing societal well-being or ensuring the most good for society. This is the best value criterion for the round. First, lethal autonomous weapons or laws are an issue of governmental policies, and because all people are equal, governments are always obligated to help as many people as possible when making decisions. Second, morality is impossible in a world where the majority of individuals are harmed. Contention 1. Laws increase the risk of nuclear war through arms racing. First, laws lack verification methods, and uncertainty about technological trajectory ensures that countries don't develop the technology safely. Professor of political science at the University of Pennsylvania, Michael Horowitz, writes in 2019 that arms races occur due to a security dilemma. When states have ability to measure each other's capabilities, but not intentions, it will be difficult for states to credibly demonstrate autonomous weapon capabilities. The difference is software, meaning verification is difficult. Uncertainty about technological trajectory means countries have significant uncertainty. Third, rules of engagement would be unknown. Use of laws might not generate predictability. Uncertainty makes it harder for countries to come to agreements. Both sides can believe they are likely to win. The dispute becomes more likely to escalate. Second, laws lower the threshold for escalation by removing a human cost to war. This makes conflict especially likely with adversaries like Russia. Senior international researcher at the RAND Corporation, Burgess Laird, writes in 2020 that the military capabilities developed by states are key determinants of whether crises will remain stable or devolve into conflict. AWS could foster crisis instability and conflict escalation between the US and Russia. A state facing an adversary with AWS is likely to fear sudden attack. These could translate into pressure to preempt, even to nuclear use. Leaders could lose ability to manage crisis. The time for exchanging communications will be foreclosed. In US hands, AWS are likely to be understood as increased counterforce operations. Russia will perceive capabilities as a threat and increase escalation. Such fears pressure Moscow to escalate to nuclear use. Contention 2, laws are ineffective. First, laws are inflexible and can't adapt to different situations. This makes conflict escalation more likely, not less. Senior Fellow and Director of Technology and National Security Program at the Center for New American Security, Paul Scar, in 2017 writes, autonomous systems can be brittle. If the context changes, they often lack the flexibility to adapt. This brittleness can be a major problem in controlling escalation. Autonomous weapons would strip away the potential for human judgment and consider the specific context for an action, thereby increasing the risk of escalation. Autonomous weapons could be detrimental to stability if they decreased human control. Accidents have led to tit-for-tat exchanges. An autonomous weapon that malfunctioned or was hacked might continue attacking the wrong targets, leading to large-scale accidents. Second, the speed of laws beyond human control means they will act in unpredictable ways, and diplomatic channels for communication between states will be rendered ineffective. SCAR furthers, autonomous weapons could undermine stability if they accelerated the pace of battle. If both sides use autonomous weapons, the outcome could be a military singularity, where the speed of action on the battlefield would eclipse the speed of human decision-making. Leaders need time to step back from pressures so that leaders can avoid war and terminate hostilities. Less human control over the initiation of conflict and escalation could make wars more likely. Contention 3, laws are vulnerable to cyber attacks. A variety of cyber attacks become easier in a world of increased autonomy. These attacks increase the chances of war. James Martin Johnson from the Center for Nonproliferation Studies in 2019 writes, AI applications to nuclear forces could make weapon systems vulnerable to cyber attacks. Spoofing, hacking, and jamming could infiltrate a nuclear weapon system, gain control of its command and control. Intense time pressures loom large. AI-enhanced cyber attacks would be impossible to detect, authenticate, attribute. NORAD have less than 3 minutes. New tech designed to modernize nuclear C3I systems can undermine effective deterrence. Further, strategic restraint does not apply to LAWs. Development and deployment is inevitable by bad faith actors who don't care about deterrence and mutually assured destruction. Professor Horowitz furthers, restraint would not apply in several situations. Groups such as the Islamic State, countries such as North Korea, could think about force in ways that lessen restraints. A higher degree of unpredictability might not be as much of a concern, since an outcome where it ends up killing civilians would be less concerning. Given its conventional military inferiority, Russia may be willing to take risk. This gap creates an incentive for Russia to automate. A country that believes they are at risk of losing a war might become more risk acceptant. For these reasons, I strongly affirm the resolution and stand open for cross-examination.
Let's do cross-ex, then we'll talk about the 1AC and cross-ex afterwards.
Okay, sounds good. Rex, are you ready for CX?
Yep.
Okay. First, the first piece of Horowitz evidence says laws lack verification methods and have uncertainty about technological trajectory. What uncertainty do countries have?
So the question of uncertainty is relative to understanding of other countries' capabilities. So for more traditional conventional weapons, it's pretty easy to determine, this country has X number of these weapons, has these specific tanks with these specific capacities, etc. And it's possible to verify that. With lethal autonomous weapons, since the factor that distinguishes them is not necessarily the function that they're carrying out, but rather the code and the algorithm behind it, it's very difficult to know what exactly other countries are developing these weapons for, or what exactly is going on in those codes. So that results in significant uncertainty that makes arms racing more likely to occur. These countries will assume that other countries and our adversaries have developed better technology and better algorithms. It also means those algorithms will be more devastating because we'll just assume that Russia is developing the most devastating forms of lethal autonomous weapons, and thus we would want our own.
Why are laws, or in the context of your layered evidence, why are laws uniquely worse than, say, human-controlled drones in terms of Russia being more threatened?
So since laws are able to operate at their kind of without any human control, you can also look to the SCAR evidence about speed that indicates that they go so fast beyond human control that they would be more likely to threaten Russia's nuclear weapons because they can move so fast and in unpredictable ways, whereas a human-controlled drone has a specific purpose and is kind of controlled by humans in a way that make it not.
Do laws not each have their own specific purposes in programming?
They do.
Okay, why are laws then sort of unpredictable, as you claim?
So that goes back to the claims about uncertainty that I was just talking about. So other countries don't know exactly what those purposes are, especially when, for example, drone swarms, which is a giant collection of drones that are kind of operating all together autonomously, are able to be more of a threat to Russia's nuclear weapons than just a single remote piloted drone that doesn't really have the same capacity for destruction,
let's talk
specifically in
about
the
the
context of nuclear weapons.
Okay, let's talk about the cyber attack stuff. Why would hacking, I guess, a law or like a single law, be something that's increased or more likely to increase a chance of war as opposed to say like hacking another weapon that already exists now?
So a few responses. First is that it's not just an individual law that would be hacked. The evidence indicates that things like our nuclear weapons systems could also be hacked, which would directly cause a nuclear war. Additionally, the evidence says that as you get more autonomous, there's a higher likelihood of them being cyber attacked. So even if other weapons being cyber attacked would cause war, those weapons aren't as likely and aren't as vulnerable to cyber attacks as lethal autonomous weapons.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, let's talk about the affirmative case and that cross-X. So clearly there's a strategy here, several contentions, somewhat diversified offense. What do some of you think maybe the rationale is for having 3 separate contentions as opposed to maybe one really long contention? Just feel free to just shout it out. Unmute yourself and shout it out.
I think a big part of that is like, let's say your opponent does manage to like have evidence or have like good reasonings to take down your one contention. If you have a diversified amount of contentions, in this case 3, even if they like take down one or like they beat you in one,
Exactly. Yeah. It's about
2 more to argue with and potentially win with.
Exactly. It's about diversification. You're spot on. Yeah, so not all contentions are created equal. Which of these seem to be the strongest and which one seems to be the weakest? There's no right or wrong answer, but does one seem really good, one seem kind of poor? What are your thoughts on the relative quality of these contentions?
Personally, I think the second contention stating that lethal autonomous weapons aren't effective is the strongest. It has like a lot of subpoints. There weren't like clear defined subpoints, but like it had a lot of points underneath it, which I thought were really good. And then I'm guessing the weakest one is probably contention 1. I feel like that was a little bit of a stretch in terms of like causal relationships.
Cool. Other thoughts? Anyone else?
To your first question, like maybe this is kind of different, but so like in the 1AR, whoever like they can kick out of like contention 1, 2, or 3. And like the strongest contention to me seems to be like contention 1 or 2, contention 3 seems to be like weaker, like very underdeveloped in comparison.
Okay, fair enough. Let's talk about cross-X. What do people think Tage's overall strategy was here, the overall approach that he was going for?
Asking what exactly in lethal autonomous weapons would cause like the event. Like if lethal autonomous weapon was hacked, like how that would cause the escalation of war, as opposed to like a different already created weapon like drones being hacked.
Yeah, I agree. Anything anyone else wants to add before we go to Tage's NC? Okay, cool. We'll do the NC.
The one NC is in the chat. I will start in a moment. All right, is everyone good? Cool. Most of the evil in this world is done by people with good intentions. Because I agree with T.S. Eliot, and because I believe that human actions result in more harmful consequences than those of autonomous weapons, I negate the resolution resolved. States ought to ban lethal autonomous weapons. First, lethal autonomous weapons or laws are defined by the Congressional Research Service in 2020 as weapon systems that once advocated or activated can select and engage targets without further intervention by a human operator, known as human out-of-the-loop or full autonomy. Second is that according to the Human Rights Watch, a ban in the context of lethal autonomous weapons is defined as prohibit not only use, but also development and production. The value for this debate is morality, since the word ought in the resolution implies a moral obligation. Prefer this since it's a prerequisite to other values, since we first need to determine what good is in order to determine whether a value is good or bad. Since government policies create trade-offs between the people they help and hurt, its unique duty is to maximize the well-being of the people its policies affect. Waller writes that moral principles often fail to acknowledge that public policies inevitably entail trade-offs among competing values, since policymakers cannot justify value conflicts to the public. Their duty to public interest requires them to demonstrate that value trade-offs caused by their policies are to the overall advantage of society. Thus, the criterion is maximizing well-being. Contention 1 is AI innovation. The Human Rights Watch definition of a law's ban indicates that ban includes development and production, not just use. However, that means that banning laws deters innovation in artificial intelligence and creates disincentives from developing AI technology due to issues with dual use. Castro and McLaughlin write in 2019 that banning lethal autonomous weapons would slow research into AI, as defense agencies have been a source of significant funding for tech advancement. Much of the research would yield dual-use technology relevant for civilian use. A ban would make it more expensive to develop AI, limit the testing and use of AI, and limit productivity, competitiveness, and innovation. Policies that increase the cost of developing AI would likely discourage innovation by creating a barrier to entry for startups that can't prove their system is safe. This limitation will thus limit innovation. Additionally, there's often a negative correlation between making an AI system more explainable and its accuracy. As a result, policies that require AI to be more explainable could lead to less accurate AI. And AI is the most important innovation regarding climate change control, making it key to help save our planet. Joe Shinov writes in 2019 that climate change has become a complex problem and that AI can be used to analyze the current causes, predict future scenarios, create new products and services, and thus monitor and minimize casualties. AI can also be used to ensure devices cut down greenhouse emissions and can detect and track emissions by combining data from multiple sources. Thus, artificial intelligence can be used to streamline processes and make them more environmentally friendly. Contention 2 is deterrence. Continuing to fund lethal autonomous weapons projects US military superiority and deterrence, but the AF hurts that. Brock, a major in the US Army, writes in 2017, the AI is already rapidly replacing people and it's natural for it to be in military applications. Americans will find themselves at a disadvantage if the US does not adopt lethal autonomous weapons, since countries like Russia and China are already developing them. If the US continues to fall behind, its military becomes fiscally unsustainable and personnel costs continue to grow. A new strategic approach will focus on improving technology and maintaining dominance to ensure all future systems are capable of human-machine teaming and fully autonomous modes. US military modernization and superiority is also necessary to maintain deterrence dynamics internationally. O'Hanlon and Miller, directors of research and foreign policy at Brookings, write in 2019 that modernization must intensify in pace. Military technology vulnerabilities could be exploited by Russia and China, and if we failed, the perception could grow that American power was fading. Deterrence could weaken, and an enemy could exploit vulnerabilities, potentially resulting in a war that we could lose. Change in computers and robotics remain fast-moving, and these breakthroughs are necessary in areas like reusable rockets, hypersonic missiles, autonomous submarines, and nanomaterials. Today's excellent military must be modernized for greater lethality and made more survivable against future attacks. Moving on to my opponent's case, we both seem to have a framework centered around well-being and consequences. Given that, I'll move straight to my opponent's contentions. Their arms racing contention is wrong because they've over-exaggerated military claims and have ignored spending trends. Perry and Shar write in 2020 that no one is building the weapons right now, and we don't see clearly oriented, fully autonomous weapons. If you look at actual expenditures, they're a small fraction of what militaries are actually spending. Second is that human error is orders of magnitude worse when it comes to the threshold for escalation. Even with algorithmic errors, AI uses more caution. Tucker writes in 2020 that artificial intelligence can actually be more cautious when data is limited. The human analyst should be less certain, but researchers found that machine learning took far less risk than humans did by lowering its confidence. My opponent's second contention is wrong for two reasons. First is that the history and structure of nuclear architecture make human use inevitable. Scary writes in 2018 that the nuclear arsenal resides in the hands of a small handful of people. Key features are thus magnified, and a small number of people determine the fate of the planet. Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson each considered using nuclear weapons, and it indicates that the presidential first-use structure is catastrophic. My opponent's last contention is incorrect because a cyber war won't occur. The potential for retaliation empirically caps cyber attacks. Baltrusitis writes in 2018 that the potential for blowback is high. Offensive cyber capabilities generate a self-limiting response because states and non-state actors limit the scope and intensity of cyber attacks based on the calculation of what they can get away with. Cyber actors rarely generate a robust response. Now, group my opponent's second and third contention. My next few responses apply to both. First is that the speed of laws is good. Expanded information transparency solves crisis miscalculation, hardens our nuclear command systems against cyber attacks, which also answers their hacking contentions, and lessens use it or lose it pressures. Horowitz writes in 2019 that autonomous systems could help buy time in ways that make escalation less likely. The amount of data would overwhelm human operators, but data processors allow decision makers to make better sense of the cluttered battle space. Awareness can reduce the risk of miscalculation and reassure leaders a surprise attack is not occurring. Resiliency of systems are subject to increased disruption in cyber, but resilience could also reduce vulnerability to disruption. Thus, I strongly urge a negative ballot.
Are you ready for cross-examination?
Yes.
Okay, so starting off on your first contention, what are the qualifications of Daniel Castro and Michael McLaughlin to make these claims about artificial intelligence and laws?
Yeah, so both of them are fellows at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, which is an international foundation sort of focused on cutting edge IT and innovation, which as modern focus is now on artificial intelligence, which is increasingly utilized in things like information technology and tech innovation.
Okay, so what is the link between the AI research that occurs as a result of lethal autonomous weapons for use in the military and the AI that is used to fight climate change?
Yeah, so the argument that I've made in this contention is that a lot of AI technology is actually dual use. And what this means is that it can be used both in defense agencies or the military, but also in civilian use. And defense agencies have significantly funded tech advancement for civilian use as well. The claim that the Castro and McLaughlin evidence is making is that a regulation of lethal autonomous weapons, to the extent that it's been banned, especially production and development, could result in a lot of barriers for dual use technology, even when their only intended use is civilian, because it could potentially be used for things like offensive military capabilities, which would A, create a lot of regulatory barriers that smaller firms may not be able to surmount.
Okay, so
B,
can you
hurt
give
things like
so can you-
innovation by banning them.
Can you give an example of a dual use technology that would be used in lethal autonomous weapons and would be used to predict future scenarios of climate change? I understand in
Yeah,
general
so
why there
a
might
lot
be
of the
link.
technology is focused around things like data processing, which guides both lethal autonomous weapons based on past scenarios and sort of using machine learning to turn those into future scenarios. But the same technology in machine learning can also be used to take past scenarios, say like warming, climate change caused by certain rates of emissions, and use that to predict future scenarios. So a lot of information processing and scenario analysis technology that's centered around machine learning can be used to take past scenarios and predict future scenarios. And a lot of that technology can be adapted to both military and civilian uses, which could create a lot of regulatory barriers.
Moving on to your second contention, your Brock evidence discusses that Russia, China, and other nations are already developing lethal autonomous weapons. Given that the app bans these weapons for every country, why is it necessary for the US to develop them?
Yeah, so the argument that the Brock evidence is making is that in terms of the next technological front, the countries like Russia and China are already developing autonomous weapons, and the US is falling behind, and that automation is necessary as personnel costs continue to grow. Because the US military is currently centered around expensive personnel costs or other systems that the Brock evidence isolates as fiscally unsustainable, switching to autonomy is necessary to both catch up to and surpass Russia and China's militaries that are more centered around technology and automation as opposed to personnel. which is why preserving lethal autonomous weapons is necessary to ensure that the United States can sort of focus in on that area and leapfrog other countries.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
Okay, what were some things that you all thought were strong about Tage's speech?
I felt that his point about the development of other AIs, specifically civilian AIs, could be impacted was strong.
Okay. What are some other things that were strong about the speech?
For the speech, ooh, my camera. I liked the part about extending the whole like lethal autonomous weapons and artificial intelligence argument past just military use by going into climate change and then just going into like deterrence and how we need to like protect ourselves. I thought that was really good. And then going over the address for the affirmative, kind of combining the value and the contentions since they both had like the same framework at the same time. So I thought that was pretty good.
Cool. What were some things that you thought were maybe weaker about Tage's speech? Let him have it.
Well, personally, I felt that the contention about the US being at a disadvantage was quite weak because the resolution is that all states, including states like Russia and China, should ban them, not just the US.
Okay. Other stuff?
Maybe the link defense for the climate change disad, or I guess the third contention.
Yeah, okay. I guess my final question. What do you think is an area where Rex maybe made some progress in CrossX in terms of setting up a strategy or really setting up objections to something in his speech? Like what was an area where he really made progress in CrossX doing that?
I think it was like definitely asking questions about like the link between AI research and AI in like climate change usage, and then just going over like how like an example for how to use in the military as well as through climate change. So really just hitting upon the first contention.
Yeah. And I thought there was a good job asking about the AF only bans it for the AF bans it for all countries, not just the United States. What is the link to that other contention? I thought that was an area where he made some good progress as well. But okay, Rex, are you ready for your 1AR?
Yeah, let me send the doc. I believe there's just
Okay.
one card. Is everybody ready? Good, cool. Okay. You should vote affirmative because laws are fundamentally immoral and decrease societal well-being. On contention 1, extend my layered evidence. Laws cause war for 2 reasons. First, they take humans out of the equation. Since no human soldiers are being risked, there's less pressure on military leaders to not go to war, which means conflicts that otherwise wouldn't have occurred now occur in a world of laws. Second, they create pressures on adversaries to escalate. Laird analyzes Russian statements and doctrine and finds that they fear the US would use laws to try to target their nuclear weapons. Russia considers their nuclear arsenal the backbone of their military, so anything they perceive as threatening it will be met with strong retaliation. This point goes unanswered. Now on to the line by line. There will be an arms race. They conceded in my definitions that laws don't currently exist and that the app is a preemptive ban, which takes out SCAR because states haven't developed laws yet. The Horowitz and Tucker evidence doesn't apply because my argument is not about unsafe development or the laws themselves being incompetent, instead how they are perceived by their adversaries in military leadership. On my second contention, they are wrong. Human nuclear use is not inevitable. We've never used nukes previously because there are strong principles of deterrence and mutually assured destruction in the status quo. However, laws threaten to undermine that, as shown in my first contention. Speed is bad. Extend my SCAR evidence. Since laws move so fast beyond human control, It means in times of crisis, humans won't know exactly what is going on and won't be able to effectively communicate with leaders of other countries diplomatically. This outweighs because diplomacy is able to solve any status quo cases of potential conflict, but there are no checks against super fast AI that goes beyond human control. On my third contention, I'll concede that there is no impact to laws causing cyber war. This doesn't take out either of my other contentions, which still stand. On to my opponent's first contention about innovation. First, a ban on laws increases peaceful and defensive AI research because it avoids the stigma against laws specifically. Sidney Friedberg in 2019 writes, a ban on lethal AI makes it easier for scientists and engineers to work with other military AI. Bioweapons Convention let biologists develop defenses against germ warfare without fear work would be perverted for offense. Ban makes it easier to develop tech that can protect lives. There would have been less pushback against Project Maven because researchers would have assurance that the technology would not be used in autonomous weapons. 2, there is simply no link. The EAF only bans lethal autonomous weapons. There's no reason countries wouldn't be able to continue developing civilian AI because that is completely separate from the military domain. This is specifically true for their impact of global warming, which was proven in CX because it has nothing to do with laws and is not the example of dual-use tech that their evidence is talking about. Third, the affirmative outweighs on time frame and probability. Global warming is really far off and really difficult to solve, as their evidence admits. It's unlikely that AI alone will be able to solve it because we still would need other policies like developing renewable energy and independently reducing carbon emissions. On the other hand, the EAF has a clear mechanism for solving the problems with laws. On to their contention about US in deterrence. 1, this ad does not make sense. Their evidence and the evidence I read in the EAF all says that other countries like China and Russia are also developing laws, which means the US wouldn't have a unilateral advantage. The plan bans every country's lethal autonomous weapons, which means it checks back against China and Russia leapfrogging the US. Second, the impact does not apply. The O'Hanlon and Miller evidence is about developing a variety of different military technologies and isn't even about lethal autonomous weapons. That shows up never in the card, which means the neg cannot solve for the entirety of US hegemony. For these reasons, I strongly urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you.
I'll start 4 minutes of prep.
Okay, let's talk about that. So what were some things you thought were strong or weak about Rex's speech?
Some things that I thought was strong was Rex's refutation against the negation case. I liked how like the one about like AI can still be developed for like uses outside of the military, and also like for the second contention talking about how the affirmative is going to be banning weapons for all states. So I guess like China and Russia wouldn't have an advantage in that case if all states were to follow the ban.
Cool. Other comments about things that were strong or weak?
I thought dropping the third contention was strong because then he had time to have several responses to the case.
Let's talk about that. So why might it be strategic to make the round smaller in the 1AR and not go for every one of your contentions? And why might there be a downside to that approach?
Well, the 1AR is a very short time to speak, and it's unrealistic to be able to extend all 3 of your contentions or all of your contentions as well as respond to all of the next contentions. So you want to drop either your contentions that won't make much of an impact or won't win, or the negs that won't make much of an impact either.
Yeah, definitely. There is, of course, a downside, which is maybe you get to carry a little bit less offense across to your 2AR, and that it makes it a little bit less, it makes it more predictable about what you have to go for. But there certainly is a good reason to make the debate smaller in the 1AR. Excuse me. Great. Okay. I guess final question. The framework debate doesn't seem to be very much of this round. What do you think maybe the I guess what do you think really the upside for either side is of agreeing on the framework and not really having a framework debate? Is it strategic that the neg did this? Is it unstrategic? What do you think?
I felt like this. You can go, Ashley.
I feel like I talked enough. You can go. So I feel like one thing that's really strategic about like not having a bigger framework debate is that since it's similar, it's just going to be more dependent on the contentions to see who wins the debate. Like with contentions, you can have more evidence with it, and you can like argue empirical evidence, and then whoever I guess wins like the most amount of contentions would be kind of winning the debate, as opposed to like really getting into like the philosophical aspect with like the criterion and the value.
Yeah, what might the downside be for the neg to do that?
Well, neg has 7 minutes, whereas like alpha has 6, so they could just use that as a sort of, the alpha, I guess, need to spend time in the 1AR to like be back to framework, which gives like the neg sort of an advantage. But like it all depends on like what framework and or like how much the 1NC spends on it.
Cool. Tage, you ready to go, or do you need more prep?
I will take my last 40 seconds.
40 seconds? Okay, I'll ask a couple more questions then. So let's talk a little bit about some of the stuff that's on the affirmative case about whether or not laws currently exist or not. What do you think the importance of this pivot is for the AF when the AF is like, it's a preemptive ban? How does that help the AF versus hurt the AF? Anyone have thoughts on the whole preemptive ban thing?
Okay, so as far as I know, I think there's only like one weapon that actually had a preemptive ban on it. For the most part, it's pretty successful. So I think it really depends on whether or not LAWs do exist or not. So if they do exist, you could go like preemptive bans work. If they don't, it would be more of like how the ban weapon sense.
Yeah, I think it's really about whether or not you can take out some of the offense that's excuse me, some of the offense about why lethal autonomous weapons are stabilizing, they enhance nuclear command and control, etc. The app is able to say, no, they don't exist currently, so they're not able to achieve those benefits. Okay, cool. Let's do the 1AR. I'm sorry, the 2NR.
Okay, is everybody ready? Okay. The core of this debate is about the military disadvantages the AF has isolated of lethal autonomous weapons versus the civilian advantages that the negative has isolated of lethal autonomous weapons. If in this speech I win reasons why the necessity of civilian dual-use technology is more significant than some far-fetched risk of militaristic war out of the Terminator movie, then you should vote negative to preserve the most well-being for the human race. Go to my first contention. My AI innovation contention claims that banning lethal autonomous weapons, including their development and production, part of the conceded Human Rights Watch definition of a ban, would chill innovation in artificial intelligence and create disincentives from adopting AI technology, which would hurt innovations regarding climate change control that are key to help save our planet. My opponent's first response is the Sidney Friedberg evidence about the stigma against laws. But first, this ignores that most of the funding for lethal autonomous weapons and autonomous technology advancement in general comes from defense agencies, especially in larger countries like the United States, Russia, and China. If we cut back on this funding by banning lethal autonomous weapons, then there's less of an incentive for defense agencies to direct large amounts of funding to technology advancement, which would hurt our ability to develop technologies that can be used for both the military and civilian use. Second is that they've misunderstood the claim about how it chills development with regulatory barriers. The regulatory barriers mean that even when a firm is developing something for civilian use, at an early point in their development, what they're building could still be redirected for military use. The burden then falls on companies to prove that their technology is something that is safe and will not be used for military purposes and is something that is explainable and accurate. However, there is a negative correlation between making an AI system more explainable and accurate because it requires humans to entirely understand the AI, which leads to less accurate and more simplistic AI that can't process as much information to produce as meaningful conclusions. It also hurts smaller firms with the potential for great innovation by creating a substantial regulatory entry barrier for startups that lack sufficient funding to cover the cost of proving their system is good. Third is that my opponent's evidence is actually about the bioweapons convention and developing defenses against germ warfare, not really focused on lethal autonomous weapons. Their next response says that we can still continue developing civilian AI, but this once again misunderstands how dual-use technology works. They've conceded the Human Rights Watch definition that because they banned the development and production, a lot of the development and production that's for civilian purposes that could also be used for military purposes would fall under scrutiny because of the ban, holding back companies from building civilian machine learning and artificial intelligence. Their third response is that global warming is something that is far off and something that cannot be solved because they say, quote, we need policies like renewable energy and reducing carbon emissions. However, first is that developing renewable energy techniques and minimizing carbon emissions is expensive and difficult, especially from a human-only perspective. The Joshinov evidence isolates that artificial intelligence can be used to help create scenarios and analyze the current causes of climate change to best mitigate greenhouse emissions from certain devices and to determine which renewable technology is most efficient. Thus, AI can info process and modify technology to make it better. Second is that my warming impact should matter more than their nuclear war impact because we know for certain that global warming and climate change are occurring because of reports from the IPCC. An international cyber war is far less likely and there's no evidence of it thus far. And third is that warming increases the risk of their impacts because things like resource scarcity as a result of climate change could increase the risk of cyber attacks, high tensions, and sabotage between countries that could lead to miscalculation militarily. I'll agree that lethal autonomous weapons aren't key to US military superiority because all countries will ban laws, but I'll still beat back my opponent's first two contentions. Their first contention is wrong because laws won't cause war. No humans being present actually decreases the risk of a lethal autonomous weapons war because without humans who may react emotionally from anger and frustration on the battlefield or who are tired and might make errors out of fatigue, there's a decreased likelihood of a war starting. Their argument about pressure on adversaries isn't intrinsic to lethal autonomous weapons because non-autonomous weapons or human-controlled weapons like drones could do the same thing. While they have talked about it being a preemptive ban in the context of an arms race, they haven't told you when this arms race will occur, and they've conceded the part of my Perry and Shar evidence from 2020 that indicates no major militaries are funneling significant amounts of funding into research and development of militarized artificial intelligence, but are instead solely focusing on non-lethal technology that's dual use at the moment. Their second contention is wrong because speed is necessary. Even if human nuclear use is not inevitable, artificial intelligence can quickly process information so that humans won't be overwhelmed. The Horowitz evidence that I read in my last speech indicates that speed reduces use or lose pressures, which decreases the likelihood of a country starting a war or launching a weapon out of fear because the lethal autonomous weapon can quickly process data to determine that there isn't a severe risk of a war starting or a surprise attack occurring. This allows countries with autonomous weapons systems to build resiliency as opposed to reacting out of fear and starting a war unintentionally or because of misguided intentions and information that only autonomous weapons can help guide and correct. Thank you.
Okay, what were some of the strengths and weaknesses of that 2NR?
He was able to show how the impacts that he presented in the negative cases were like more impactful or should be held in higher regard than the AF ones because the AF some of the AF impacts would come as a result of the neg impacts.
So you think the weighing was good? That makes sense. Weighing is so important in these debates when the impacts are so different. One about warming and one about, a war taking place. Other thoughts on what was good or bad about that speech?
Another thing that I thought was good was that he really further elaborated on like the whole how AI can be used for like civilian use as well as like military use, and then how like banning one would lead to like the downfall of the other. He really elaborated on that more than in the first NC. So I thought that was good.
Cool. Okay. Awesome. Yeah, so what do you think the strategic rationale was for going for the first contention and not the second?
Wait, so did you say like what did you say what like strategic rationale?
Yeah, what was Tage thinking?
Oh, I might be wrong on this, but I think that he did concede the argument that like on the affirmative side, it would be banning weapons or lethal autonomous weapons for all nations. So like the whole the United States will fall behind wouldn't really count. But he did really weigh impacts on his first contention better. So a lot of like weighing.
Cool.
Strategy.
And what do you think the ballots that Tage is setting up here are? Like, what are the arguments that he's forwarding for why he can win? I can think of 2 different ballots that he's setting up. What do you think those might be?
I think there's like a good advantage argument that he made about speed and being able to process massive amounts of information, because that's something that happens immediately, whereas like climate change or like US hedge is like a little bit harder to measure. So I think that one argument of like that immediate advantage that speed is just necessary for war, and it like AI is like more logical in making decisions. I thought that was probably a good argument and one of the strongest ones, particularly on the next side.
Yeah, what's the other ballot then? So you've one that's the case turns. You know, AI is better for this. What's the other ballot? It's not hard. It's not a trick question. It's the NC. He goes for his contention. That's another reason to vote for him. The 2 possible ballots are the contention that he goes for and then the case turns. Okay, cool. Let's listen to the 2AR.
So for a quick off-time roadmap, the order will be the AF case and then the neg contention. Is everybody ready? Okay. Remember, Elon Musk, Stephen Hawking, and 4,500 AI researchers all agree that lethal autonomous weapons are bad and should be banned. That sort of consensus only exists for an issue as clear-cut as lethal autonomous weapons. On to my contention. Extend the layered evidence. Laws create pressures on adversaries to escalate. Our evidence is the best evidence in this debate because it analyzes Russian statements and doctrine and finds that what Russia fears most and what Putin fears most is the threat to his nuclear arsenal. In the status quo, there are no strong threats to his arsenal. Page has brought up the point that maybe drones can do the same thing. That is flat out not true because drones are not fast enough, cannot move at speeds beyond human control. And also, there aren't enough human-controlled drones to cause the same sort of threats to Russia's nuclear weapons that new technologies and lethal autonomous weapons would be able to. So the only scenario in which there's strong pressure on Russia to start a nuclear war is in the world of the affirmative. It doesn't decrease the risk of nuclear war, and speed is not good. They conceded the explicit weighing I did in the 1AR that diplomacy and communication is able to resolve those conflicts. There's no situation where humans would become too emotional and cause a war because leaders between countries have effective diplomatic channels for communication. However, those cannot effectively exist in a world of lethal autonomous weapons because they move too fast for humans to be able to maintain those same diplomatic channels for communication. So we're putting all our eggs in the basket of trusting these robots to be able to conduct these same things at extremely high speeds, which simply is unsafe. On to my opponent's contention. I'll start with the weighing debate. Arms racing in war should come first. Warming can only be solved with a high degree of international cooperation, which won't occur in a world in which countries are fighting with each other and racing to develop the biggest, baddest AI with inherent distrust for each other. AI can only mitigate the worst impacts of warming, but can't directly solve it. Think about how ridiculous my opponent's argument is. Obviously, banning lethal autonomous weapons is not the make or break issue for solving a problem as complex as global warming, given that there's no plans for how the status quo is going to solve it. On to my opponent's link arguments. They are not specific to warming. Their evidence discusses autonomous vehicles, And all of their arguments about regulatory barriers are in the context of a completely separate policy, which is about regulation based upon the precautionary principle, which is about regulating AI, not regulating or banning lethal autonomous weapons, which means it is completely distinct from the affirmative and actually admits that these sort of civilian technologies can still be developed in a world in which we ban laws, because laws that are used in the military and the sort of AI that is used to predict for global warming are completely different. So since those two can both coexist, however, the net cannot solve the inherent problems with lethal autonomous weapons, I strongly urge an affirmative ballot. Thank you.
Great. So what were some of the strengths and weaknesses of that 2AR from Rex?
I think Rex did a good job on kind of like reducing everything, since the 2AR is like the shortest speed in the entire debate. I think he did a good job condensing down like the big reasons into like a couple key points, as opposed to trying to go over everything during the, or addressing everything that went on during the 6-minute negative rebuttal.
Cool. Okay, what else?
I thought he did good on minimizing the whole possibility of like global warming and like solving that through like AI and like the banning stuff by saying that it's not going to be the make or break issue. I thought he did a good job of like minimizing what Tage was saying, since like there's a broader thing aside from LAWs and AI.
Okay, anyone else?
Like the 2AR like really sticks to like the speed argument, or I don't know what label it is, but like they stick to that one argument, like they collapse to it and then weigh it really nicely against climate change. Oh, and also like this sort of, I guess, spin with the explanation of like drones versus like swarms was like also kind of help provide backup to their argument.
Cool. Okay. Why doesn't everybody take now, let's say, 5 minutes till 6:02 to write an RFD? Think about the debate and come up with an RFD. You get 5 minutes for that. Okay, let's do RFDs. Is everyone ready, or do you need a little more time? I'm going to assume people are ready then. Okay, who wants to give an RFD first? Go for it.
Okay, so in mine, I said that the affirmative one, oh shoot, sorry. I said that the affirmative one for three basic reasons. So basically, since like the framework was pretty similar, I just went off like contentions. The first one is like the speed of LAWs. I thought the affirmative one, this one, just because like if the lethal autonomous weapons are too fast, then like diplomats won't be able to like engage in communication, which would lead to increase of wars or like escalation in this case. The second reason would be the dual usage of AI. So the first one is that like climate change can only be solved if like diplomats are communicating, and like if lethal autonomous weapons are being made and arms race happen, then they can't really communicate for that, and thus they can't really solve the arms race thing. The second reason is that the AI ban isn't really what the resolution is talking about. The resolution is talking about lethal autonomous weapons ban, and even if that was still the case, then they could still be developed separately. The third reason is like the U.S. hedge argument. So I guess that was kind of like dropped by the negation in the case that like underneath the affirmative that China and Russia still wouldn't be able to use lethal autonomous weapons. So then they wouldn't be getting ahead of the U.S. So that's why I said the affirmative one.
Awesome. Okay, other RFDs. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, I actually gave the reason of decision to neg. I think the negative gave a better job of painting the impacts that the affirmative gave as like unrealistic. For instance, like the nuclear escalation one, he did a good job of painting how like it would be unlikely, and the impact of say climate change would be far more likely and would have another direct impact on like everything else. I think the negative also did a good job with the AI thing, like contrary to what Ashley just said. I think that it was pretty relevant to the case, considering that the framework was on general well-being, and considering how AI would have improved said general well-being. I think the fact that we'd be withholding or like development of such things through this ban made it pretty good. The negative also did a good job of pointing out how it would link to the link from the ban on lethal autonomous weapons, which is why I gave it to them. Yeah, that's about it.
Okay, what about Maya or Shania?
I ended up voting for the affirmative because I thought, like, for starters, that he won the climate change argument about how it's not going to be the make or break all, since there's still like other AI and LAWs that's going to like change the whole like course of AI. And then I bought the argument how LAWs is going to ruin deterrence through speed and putting pressure on diplomatic channels and like breaking and weakening them. And I also just thought they did a good job of extending the layered evidence throughout the case. So I basically voted off of that.
All right. Maya, how about you?
I think the affirmative one, because they were also extending like their evidence, and they were properly rebutting all of their opponent's arguments, and I think they dealt with the negative pretty well too.
Okay, cool. So yeah, what questions do you all have about the debate? Rex can answer some, I can answer some. Let's just talk about the debate a little bit. Yeah, any questions about it? No questions about the debate? Nothing? Okay, last call for questions. Anything? Okay, in that case, you're free to go. Thanks for coming to the round. Hope it was useful.